Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid. Some people love their hometowns and have very fond memories of them. Some people couldn't wait to grow up and get the hell out of there. But the people in today's stories often had mixed emotions. They remember the good times, but for them, the nostalgia isn't enough to wash clean the physical and emotional hurt and betrayal they feel when they think of these towns. Each place, Love Canal, Centralia, Times Beach, and Wittenoom, would poison their residents and eventually drive them away, leaving behind ghost towns, never to be called home again. In the late 1890s, a man by the name of William T. Love envisioned a dream community and wanted it built as part of Niagara Falls, New York. He believed that a canal built between the upper and lower Niagara rivers would provide a cheap source of energy for this dream neighborhood. Construction would begin, but it wouldn't get very far. An economic scare would lead to a loss of investors and halted construction. The plans to continue the canal in the future would die altogether when a bill was passed that prohibited removal of water from the rivers in order to protect and preserve them. The canal was left as a ditch until the land was bought by the company Hooker Chemical. Hooker Chemical, also known as Hooker Electrochemical Company, produced caustic soda and bleaches. In 1942, Hooker Chemical, with permission from the government, began using the partially dug-out canal as a dump site for their chemical waste. Between 1942 and 1953, Hooker would dump around 21,000 pounds into it. It's important to note that at least 12 of the chemicals dumped are also known to cause cancer. What's interesting is that if you look for Hooker Chemical on the internet, a law firm's website pops up now. When you go to that website, at the very top of the page is a blaring red box. The text within the box asks if you are a former employee who has been diagnosed with lung cancer. Hooker Chemical wasn't just a danger to the community, but also to their own employees. In 1953, Hooker Chemical was done with the site and had it covered over with clay and soil. Soon, the city of Niagara, seeing this empty land, would ask to buy the land, expressing that they wished to build an elementary school there. At first, Hooker Chemical refused to sell the land, knowing that 20 feet below the surface there were thousands of pounds of toxic waste and that it was a potential risk. City officials wanted that land come hell or high water. If Hooker Chemical wasn't going to sell, they were going to take it through expropriation. Expropriation is when the government takes something for use for the public. Hooker Chemical had no real choice but to sell. Not wanting to be held responsible, they sold the land for a single dollar, but made sure that the legal documents explained that there were dangerous chemicals buried below, and that Hooker Chemicals waived any liability. City officials ignored the dire warnings outlined in the sale documents and got to work building the school and selling off the other parts of the land for houses to be built on. The Love Canal neighborhood would be comprised of 36 blocks within the city. In the late 1970s, the area around 99th Street Elementary School became a hotbed for ailments. After a few consecutive wet winters, the water table beneath the city rose and caused the chemicals buried below the school to seep out. The chemicals got into the sewer system, into neighborhood basements, and oozed up into the school's playground. Soon, residents of the Love Canal neighborhood had higher than normal rates of epilepsy, asthma, kidney disease, miscarriages, birth defects, among other problems. One little girl was born deaf, had a cleft palate, an extra row of teeth, and was developmentally delayed. In 1976, the local newspaper, the Niagara Gazette, would make the first reports regarding the leaching chemicals. What was surprising was that the newspaper wasn't telling the locals anything that they didn't already know. They all knew the area had been a waste dump, but since it had been long covered over, no one knew that it posed any risk. But a journalist who visited the area reported seeing waste disposal drums sticking up out of people's yards. He observed that a lot of the vegetation, including the trees, were dead and some had turned black. He also reported that there were visible puddles of chemicals throughout the neighborhood, and tests would reveal that the area affected was 3 times larger than previously known. Lois Gibbs believed she was living an almost perfect life. Her husband worked at the local chemical factory, and she was a stay-at-home mom to 2 children. They lived in a beautiful and quiet neighborhood. They lived just 3 blocks from the river, which ran beside the children's school. One morning, in April of 1978, she sat down to her morning paper and her cup of coffee. The newspaper, the Niagara Gazette, had an article that piqued her interest. The article reported that harmful chemicals were found in a neighborhood within the city. As she read, she was surprised when she realized it was her neighborhood that they were talking about. It was then that she finally realized why her kids seemed to be sick all of the time. She decided that she couldn't just sit by. She began investigating the numbers of cases of illness in the area and reported her gathered information to public health officials, who brushed her off. She would attend some community meetings and express her concerns and share her data. She would eventually end up being chosen as the chairperson for the local homeowners association. After the initial relocation of the first 240 families, the Love Canal Homeowners Association would end up joining with 2 other organizations to fight for the relocation of the other 700 families in the area. It would take 2 years before they would win the fight, even though the damage had already been done. Lois Gibbs is still an activist today, but now she focuses on fighting against fracking. In 1978, the president, Jimmy Carter, declared a health emergency for Love Canal. Eventually, efforts for cleanup would lead to the Superfund program, which cleans up areas in the United States that are heavily contaminated by hazardous materials. 239 families were initially relocated, and 700 other families were told that their risk wasn't high enough for the government to pay for their relocation. It would be another 3 years before those organizations were successful and a second state of emergency was declared, and those other families were finally relocated. Even after relocation, DNA testing would show that many people who had lived in the area had damage to their DNA, which put them at a much greater risk for developing cancers. It would also lead to higher levels of birth defects for the children of those who had lived in Love Canal. Their time living in Love Canal will continue to affect those people and possibly their children for the rest of their lives. Whereas the people in Love Canal didn't know that their town was in danger, the people in Centralia, Pennsylvania knew for decades that danger was creeping closer and closer. Centralia was a small town of around 1,400 people in eastern Pennsylvania when everything began. It was May 27, 1962, when the landfill in Centralia was ignited in order to dispose of the garbage. Side note, in the 1960s, they weren't so conscious about the environment. What they didn't know was that the landfill just so happened to sit over a long abandoned leg of the mine just outside of town. It is believed that flames found their way into the tunnel, igniting it and the mine below. It is important to know that the Centralia mine was an anthracite coal mine. There are 4 different types of coal, and the type depends on the amount of carbon that it contains. Anthracite coal, which is mined solely in northeastern Pennsylvania, has the highest carbon content. It's hard to ignite, but when it does burn, it burns for far longer and far hotter than the other types of coals. It is estimated that the temperatures down in the mine reached 500 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't long before people realized that something was wrong when the landfill had failed to extinguish itself. So when it continued to burn, the fire department was called in to deal with it. They put out the fire, and that was that. But it wasn't. The very next day, the fire department was called back out to the landfill. Somehow, it was burning again. And no matter how many times they would extinguish it, soon enough, it was burning again. Eventually, they would finally figure out that it was the mine below that was continuously reigniting the landfill. What is surprising is that it wasn't taken very seriously, and real efforts to try to extinguish the fire inside the mine wouldn't start until November, 6 months after the fire began. By then, the fire had already spread outside of the old leg of the mine, and they had a difficult time trying to get ahead of it. By spring, the town had dumped what funds they had and couldn't afford to keep going. Months into it, they discovered that it was already futile. The fire had already spread past where the trench was being dug. Without any more ideas and without the funds, the efforts to stop the fire were dead. It wouldn't be until May of 1967, 5 years after the start of the ordeal, that attempts began again. The town officials told residents that they planned on creating underground barriers made from crushed stone and water. Remembering how the trench had failed before, the people who lived on the outer parts of town, those closest to the encroaching fire, demanded something drastic be done. The officials went back to the drawing board, but another 2 years would pass. In 1969, a new type of barrier was chosen and construction began again. Those barriers were made of something called fly ash. Now, this was a very controversial decision because it is a very fine coal residue that's a byproduct of coal-fired factories. Fly ash is known to contain heavy metals such as mercury, arsenic, copper, and chromium. Heavy metals are very toxic to people, so this was not a popular choice. It was even less popular when it too failed to stop the ever closer fire. Over the next 8 years, yes, you heard that right, over the next 8 years, barriers would be continually constructed and would continually fail. And finally, the fire reached the town. It smoldered below as the residents began experiencing health problems and they began to realize how much danger they were really in. In 1981, a boy would come very close to being the fire's first victim. Todd Dombowski was 12 years old when he was sent by his mother to do a little investigating. News had spread around town that there were state officials visiting their small town, and his mother wanted to know why. He headed out, but as he was on his way, something caught his attention. He got a glimpse of something peculiar. He saw smoke coming up through the ground beside a large tree. As he got closer to get a better look, the ground gave way and he fell in. The hole wasn't initially too deep, but it was filled with smoke. He had managed to grab onto the roots of the tree and tried to pull himself out, but the sides of the hole would fall away and he felt himself sink further. He began screaming for help, and by some miracle, his cousin Eric just so happened to be nearby. Eric heard the screams and found Todd and quickly pulled him to safety. Later, testing would reveal that Todd had been extremely lucky to have been found so fast. The analysis would reveal that the gas that had come up from the ground and then had filled the hole was a deadly concentration of carbon monoxide. Had he not been rescued so quickly, he would have asphyxiated within minutes. This near tragedy really woke up the people of Centralia, and this would lead to the federal government getting involved. The story of the boy almost swallowed by the earth was sensational, and people demanded action. It would still, of course, take another 2 years for Congress to pass a bill that would relocate the citizens of Centralia. At that point, government officials estimated that it would cost $660 million to put the fire out. Another estimate would appear that said if serious action had taken place when the mine first caught fire, the cost to put it out would have only cost $50,000. Initially, only half of the population decided to take up the government on its offer for relocation. For many, Centralia was their home, and to leave it behind was a very emotional decision. Many had lived out their entire lives there. Slowly, over time, as the town grew more and more deserted, people continued to move away. And in 1992, Centralia officially was unincorporated. The government took ownership over the land and then posted signs throughout warning visitors of the risks of toxic gases and sinkholes. If you go to Centralia today, you will find that cracks in the ground have opened up all over town and allow for gases such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and methane to escape. All are deadly. Due to their exposure to these gases over a period of years, the former residents report higher than normal rates of respiratory diseases, gastrointestinal diseases, and high blood pressure. Most surprising to me about this story is even today, 32 years after losing its status as a town, and in spite of the dangers that still lurk, Centralia is actually still home to 4 people. The fire has been burning for 62 years as of 2024 and is projected to continue burning through all of the coal still in the mine for the next 250 years. This next town was also a small town whose lack of financial prosperity would lead to disaster. 17 miles outside of St. Louis, Missouri, was Times Beach. It was supposed to be a resort town along Route 66, the famous highway that ran from Chicago to Santa Monica, California. But it really only had a small population that lived there year-round. The town was established in 1925 when the St. Louis Times-Ledger offered cheap plots of land if people subscribed to the newspaper. Unfortunately, the deal wasn't as popular as was expected, and the town at its height would only have 2,242 residents. The real story of Times Beach would begin in 1972 when the town hired a man named Russell Bliss to spray the dirt roads in town. With the town only having dirt roads, the amount of dust and dirt stirred up became a nuisance. Bliss's plan was to spray the roads with motor oil to adhere the dirt to the ground. The town was especially happy with this deal since it would only cost them 6 cents per gallon. Bliss's day job was in waste removal and was paid to remove chemical waste from a nearby factory. He figured that instead of disposing of the chemical waste properly, he might as well make some money off of it. He mixed the waste with the motor oil and then proceeded to spray the town over a 4-year period. He didn't really know what was in the mixture, but threw caution to the wind. The chemicals that he had been paid to get rid of was a mixture that included hexachlorophene and dioxin. Hexachlorophene was once used as a popular disinfectant, but was also used in a number of different applications, including cosmetics and medications. Unfortunately, it is easily absorbed orally and through the skin. People exposed to it can experience weakness, confusion, and seizures. These symptoms are caused by damage to the nerves within the brain. It can cause dangerous amounts of swelling that can lead to coma or death. If you think that hexachlorophene sounds bad, just wait till you hear about dioxin. If you are familiar with the name, it's probably because it's a deadly chemical found in Agent Orange. The factory that Bliss had gotten the chemical waste from was one of the manufacturers of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Without going into too much detail, as Agent Orange could have its own video, it was an herbicide that was famously used in Vietnam during the war to clear out trees and foliage. Over 3 million people in Vietnam were exposed to Agent Orange and developed a whole range of diseases that included several types of cancer, brain disease, neurological diseases, and also caused various types of birth defects. Dioxin was implicated in the deaths of over 300,000 Vietnam vets and over 400,000 Vietnamese people. The amount of negligence is unbelievable. Bliss should have known pretty quickly how toxic the mixture was. Before he began spraying the roads, he had been hired by a local horse stable to spray their property. Not long after finishing, 62 of the horses kept at the stable died, and even the stable owner's daughter became very sick. Bliss claimed that it couldn't have been what he had been spraying because it was just motor oil. After the deaths of the horses, town officials requested the EPA to investigate, but nothing would be done for 8 years. The government can't do anything quickly. When the EPA finally arrived and conducted testing, they would find dioxin all over town. It would be another 3 years before they actually went public with their findings, and only did so because the local river had flooded and spread the chemicals beyond the confines of the roads. The amount of dioxin found in the town was astronomical. The news of the Agent Orange road spread far and wide, and the president eventually got involved. But as is common with all of these stories, it would be years before anything happened. 3 years after the EPA revealed their findings, the federal government finally stepped forward and offered to pay for the town's residents to be relocated. In 1985, Times Beach lost its status as a town, and only a single elderly couple stayed behind. It wouldn't be for another 11 years that the government would actually do anything to clean up the town. The mixture sprayed on the roads cost a mere 6 cents per gallon, but the cleanup ended up costing $250 million. It was learned that Times Beach wasn't the only place that Bliss had been hired to spray. He was connected to 27 other areas in eastern Missouri. In 1996, over 37,000 pounds of contaminated dirt from Times Beach and a further 265,000 pounds of dirt from other towns were finally incinerated. Once the cleanup was completed, the land that was once the town of Times Beach, Missouri, was converted into the Route 66 State Park. The last town we'll be covering today is the only one outside of the U.S. It was so hard to narrow down the list for this video, and some of the other options could have videos all of their own. At some points, towns like Pripyat in Ukraine and Flint, Michigan will get their own videos. But without further ado, let me tell you about the last town. Wittenoom was a town in Western Australia that was once home to around 20,000 people, and as of 2022, the very last resident, an 80-year-old woman, was forced to move, leaving it an abandoned ghost town. It all began in the 1940s. Australia wanted to move towards populating Western Australia, the largest state, which makes up around 33% of the country. Even today, it is only home to around 10% of Australians, but back then, it was even less populated. As part of the effort, the government encouraged companies to create jobs in Western Australia in hopes that towns would pop up around the job opportunities. One of the companies that would get involved was Colonial Sugar Refinery. It began in the 1800s as a sugar processing company which sold sugar, but also byproducts such as molasses and ethanol. In the 1930s, they decided to expand their company's reach and started a new company that was called Australian Blue Asbestos, and it would set up shop in an area called Wittenoom Gorge. Asbestos was what they were mining for, and initially they didn't realize how dangerous asbestos was. But over time, they would learn. There are 6 different types of asbestos, but they mined one type in Wittenoom, blue asbestos, as in the name of the company, Australian Blue Asbestos. Blue asbestos is also known as chrysotolite and was used in spray-on coatings, insulation for steam engines and pipes, and was also used in plastic and cement. Today, in Australia, it's completely banned and has been illegal to have since 2003. Asbestos is a well-known danger in the U.S. today, and when Americans think of asbestos, we think of the old TV commercials. If you or a loved one has been diagnosed with mesothelioma, you may be entitled to compensation. Initially, people can experience asbestosis, which is inflammation and scarring of the lungs caused by inhalation of asbestos fibers. This can happen pretty quickly with the higher levels of exposure. The symptoms of asbestosis can include shortness of breath, a persistent dry cough, chest tightness or pain, and strangely enough, clubbing of the fingers and toes. Turns out that clubbing is usually caused by prolonged low levels of oxygen. Then, decades after exposure, people can develop mesothelioma, which is a type of cancer of the lining of organs. It most commonly affects the lungs and is most commonly caused by the inhalation of asbestos fibers. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the 4 main risk factors for mesothelioma are working with asbestos, living with someone who works with asbestos, living or working in a building where asbestos has been disturbed, such as during renovation, and lastly, living in an area with natural asbestos or living near asbestos mines or factories. Mesothelioma's survival rates greatly depend on the age of the person diagnosed. A person under the age of 50 has a 30% chance of being alive after 10 years. It's 8.5 for someone between 65 and 74 years old, and only 4.1% of those aged 75 or older are alive 10 years after diagnosis. The average survival time, though, is between 18 and 31 months after diagnosis. But let's get back to Wittenoom. Mining in Wittenoom began in 1943 and would eventually employ around 7,000 men and women. And later, when the town was built, it would be a home to a total of 14,000 adults and around 6,000 children. Immediately the following year, it was apparent that there were going to be problems. A mine inspector showed up and noticed the heavy amount of dust that was being produced between the mine and the mill. Nothing was being done to control the levels, so the inspector informed the managers of the mine that they would have to come up with something. And guess what? Nothing happened. They did nothing to curtail the asbestos dust, and the inspectors didn't follow up to make sure that something was actually done. 2 years later, in 1946, the first reported case of asbestosis was discovered among one of the miners, and the managers did write to corporate headquarters. Do you know what corporate did about that? Nothing. The mine still failed to do anything about the dust, and no one did anything about their failure to do so. It should be said that at the time, people were just learning that asbestos wasn't as safe as previously thought, and Colonial Sugar Refinery failed to put the safety of Wittenoom above the priority of money. Another year later, in 1947, it was determined that the Wittenoom mining settlement was too small for their population growth, and that they began construction of a town, Wittenoom, at the mouth of the Wittenoom Gorge. In 1948, another inspection of the mine would determine that the levels of asbestos found were 6 to 8 times higher than the accepted safe limit at the time. Management of the mine was warned that action would be taken if they failed to cut down the amount of dust. Surprise! Again, they did nothing. In 1951, another inspection of the mine was done. That year, an official safe dust limit was established in Western Australia, and it would be set at 176 parts per cubic centimeter. Wittenoom's levels at the time were found to be over 1,000 parts per cubic centimeter. Yet again, warnings are given, nothing is done. To put the danger of Wittenoom's asbestos levels in perspective, the safe rate today isn't 176 parts per cc, but 0.1 parts per cc. It was 10,000 times higher than what would be considered safe today. In 1953, a second mine, the Colonial Mine, opened and began operations. It was observed that same year that the dust clouds were now large enough that they could be seen drifting down and settling over Wittenoom town. At this point, more specific recommendations were issued, and they said that dust collectors should be installed. Were they? I'll give you a second to guess. No, of course they weren't. The following year, in 1954, yet another inspection was done on the mine, and this time, the inspector would report back that Wittenoom was a disgrace, and that if conditions didn't improve, that he would shut the whole thing down. But guess what? Yeah, that's right. He didn't do anything. The amount of negligence between the managers of the mine and the larger corporation is the real disgrace. In 1957, yes, 3 years later, something would finally be done. Of course, they didn't do anything about the dust. No, absolutely not. No, they started giving the miners hazard pay, or what was called dust allowance. In 1958, the first mine, the Wittenoom mine, would close and the Colonial mine would take over operations. The mill attached to the Wittenoom mine would continue to run, but they decided to build a second mill, predictably named the Colonial Mill. Also, sometime in 1958, dust-reducing equipment would finally be installed in the mine. In response to the new equipment, however, the miners saw their hazard pay, or dust allowance, cut in half. Regardless of the new dust-reducing equipment, we know that the amount of asbestos was still far over what would be considered safe today, and rising cases of asbestosis in Wittenoom reflected that. At that point, the public health department got involved, and began an investigation. The health department would find that a good portion of the Wittenoom workforce was affected by asbestosis, and that the dust suppression equipment already installed wasn't enough and more dust suppression was needed. In 1960, the original mill closed and all operations shifted over to the other mill. 1960 would also mark a tragic milestone when the first case of mesothelioma appeared in someone who had worked in Wittenoom 15 years before. It was concluded in 1960 that Wittenoom was 30 times more dangerous than other mining towns. The next tragic milestone would appear the next year when the first person died from exposure to asbestos. Over time, many people aside from the miners would become sick. Wives of the miners often developed asbestosis or later mesothelioma after coming into contact with asbestos fibers left on their husband's clothes. Not to mention that the roads in Wittenoom were covered with asbestos tailings or leftover fibers. It was done to help cut down the amount of red dust from the desert ground that could easily become airborne with the wind. But this only increased the area already contaminated by asbestos and exposed the wider population in the town, including the 6,000 children living there. I saw a picture that broke my heart. It was a picture of two little boys innocently playing in the dirt. The caption of the picture revealed that those two little boys later died in their 30s due to their exposure to asbestos. In spite of the incredibly dangerous levels of asbestos in Wittenoom, mining wouldn't stop until December of 1966, and it only stopped because it was no longer profitable. In 1950, Olga Soder and her family left Austria and immigrated to Australia. They fell in love with the natural beauty of the Australian outback, the colors, the gorges, the small town that would become their home. She would live there for the next 45 years, but that love couldn't last. She told reporters that back then, nobody talked about the dangers of asbestos or asbestos mining. She said they were never informed of how dangerous the area was, and if she had been told, she admitted that they never would have moved there. She admitted sadly that the town should never have been built. It is estimated that around 1,200 people have died from exposure to asbestos in Wittenoom. And that wraps it up for today. If you wanted to learn more about today's topic, you can find some recommendations for documentaries below. Also below will be links for the resources that I used. If you want to see more from me, like this video and subscribe, and feel free to comment any other deadly towns that you're familiar with. Also, see the community page to vote on next week's topic. A new video drops every Monday. Be merry, but stay morbid.